Lesson 4, Part B, ties. We'll continue talking about ties. Now we'll take a look at the second tie in English, and we'll see what that is in just a second. But a tie is when you change one part of a sentence, you may have to change another. So let's take a look. George is sick today. And we can actually do a lot with this sentence now. We can show that we have a shifter today. We can find the X word places, two X word places. We can also find the subject. It's the word or words between those two places. We know the predicate is over here between the subject and the shifter. And in our first lesson, Part A, about ties, we saw that X words can tie with subjects like is and George. Now, let's take a look at our next sentence. George was sick yesterday. The shifter is yesterday. Was is the X word. Two second X word place in front of George. George is the subject. The predicate was sick. And now we can also show that X word was ties with the subject George. Now, is there another tie in this sentence? I think we'll quickly say yes, there is. It looks like is ties with today, and was ties with yesterday. And this shows me we have a tie. When I change one part of a sentence, like today to yesterday, the time, I also change the X word, is to was. So is has two ties. It ties with the subject George and also ties with the time present today. George was sick yesterday. The X word was has two ties. Was ties with the subject George and was ties with the past time yesterday. Let's take a look at another sentence. And this is kind of fun for me. I always enjoy this. I like to find the different places, and now we're starting to see that there's relationships among places in a sentence. So for today, for example, the shifter is today. The X word is was. Every sentence has two X word places, and between those two places is the subject. In this sentence, it's George. Everything from the subject to the end of the sentence or the shifter is the predicate, and of course there are always at least one tie in a sentence. Let's take a look. What do we have here? Does ties with George, just like we saw in Part A. The X word does ties with subjects that can be changed with he, she, and it. And now we're seeing that the X word does also ties with this present time today. In our next sentence, let's change today to yesterday, and we'll take a look and see what else changes. We have did. Did George not work? The subject is George. The predicate is everything from George to the end shifter. I don't have much room, so I'm not going to draw it in here. It's going to get a little too messy. And the X word did doesn't tie with George. George did not, I did not, you did not, we did not, they did not. There's no subject that's going to make me change the X word did. But when I changed today to yesterday, I had to change does to did. So we can see here is the tie between the X word and the time. George has eaten lunch. I don't see any shifter, Let's take a look at our X word places. Here's one. Here's the second one. The subject is George. The predicate is everything from the subject to the end of the sentence. Are there any ties? Yeah, you bet there are. Has ties with George, and has also ties with the present. Now, when we say sentences that have an X word like has or have, usually we don't really have a time stated in there. George has eaten lunch. He has visited different places. George has worked very hard. Very often we don't use times, but has ties with the present. And I can show you that by changing our sentence by adding the shifter before he went to work. When I take a look at the sentence now, George had eaten lunch before he went to work, I see there's been a change. Let's take a look at the X word. Had. Had George eaten lunch? George is the subject. The predicate is had eaten lunch. I'm not going to draw it in because it's going to get too crowded in here. Does had tie with George? I'd have to say no, because I could test this. I had eaten lunch, you had eaten lunch, George had eaten lunch, we had eaten lunch, they had eaten lunch. I really never change had because I changed George. So why does this sentence have had? Because had ties with this past time before he went to work. We're going to see that all X words tie with time. There's 20 X words. Each X word ties with time. For example, X words that tie with the present: am, are, is, do, does, can, may, should, will, shall, has, have, and must. The other 7 X words, 13 X words tie with the present. The other 7 X words all tie with the past: was, were, did, could, might, would, and had. Please take a look now at exercise 1 from lesson 4 part B. We'll complete that exercise. We'll check it, and then we'll continue on because we have our third tie to talk about next.